Hello viewers, welcome back where we cover solved and unsolved true crime cases that focus mainly on, well, serial killers, hence the name. Firstly, the lighting is a choice. I want to make this as creepy and spooky as possible. And I'll be your host for this creepy journey. Now, before we get started, I just want to make you all aware that this is part two of the Albert Fish case. So if you haven't yet seen part one, make sure wherever it is, you go back and you watch it so you don't miss out all the details of his younger years. I won't be doing much of a recap in this episode, so if you've decided to stay on, close your eyes, block your ears, so you don't get any spoilers. You have been warned. Okay, so that's done. Are you ready? Dim the lights, lock those doors. This is part two of the gruesome case of the Brooklyn vampire, Albert Fish. So as I said, a really quick recap on Albert Fish's early life. Albert had a very old father when he was born, who died when Albert was very young, which severely messed up the family, financially speaking, and most likely mentally. So Albert spent most of his childhood in an orphanage where, sadly, he was regularly abused. Now, this had an understandably profound impact on Albert's state of mind, which culminated in him spying on other children and taking an unusual interest in some what would be considered strange sexual fetishes. And as he got older, these urges turned violent. And not only did he mutilate a few people, mainly children, he started his killing spree. Now in part two, we're actually going to focus on one of his most infamous murders, the awful killing of Grace Budd. If you have heard of it before, you know what's coming. If you haven't, well, I can only apologise for how disturbing this tale really is. We'll also look briefly at some of Albert's other murders, which weren't uncovered until later on. We'll also look at his trial and ultimately what happened to him in the end. This grisly tale continues with a classified ad that Fish saw in the Sunday edition of the New York World on the 25th of May, 1928, stating that a young man of only 18 years old was looking for a job in the country and had included his address. It amazes me how people used to find work back then. Imagine doing that now. Just putting your address on Facebook and saying, you know, come over and have a chat, I'm looking for a job. Wow, the mind boggles. You probably go viral on LinkedIn and get hired for your ingenuity. A few days later, 58-year-old Fish visited Edward Budd, the 18-year-old young man in question, pretending to be interested in hiring him. Now, Fish later confessed, and unsurprisingly, he had dark intentions for Edward, including tying him up, mutilating him, and then leaving him to bleed to death. Sicko. Fish introduced himself in an alias as a farmer and promised to hire both Edward and his friend and send for them in a few days. Fish, being the unreliable sod that he was, ended up failing to show on the agreed date, but ended up sending a telegram, apologising, and agreed on a later date. The later date came, and upon returning to the Budd residence, Fish came across Edward's younger sister, Grace, a girl of only 10 years old. It was in that moment Fish's interest switched completely from 18-year-old Edward to now this very innocent 10-year-old girl. Now, psychopaths being psychopaths, Fish made up some strange but convincing story about a niece and her birthday party that he was attending that very evening, and madly managed to convince Grace's parents to allow Fish to take Grace with him to this fantasy birthday party. They'd only just met the man. Again, the mind boggles. They were either super trusting, super stupid, or couldn't care less about their daughter's well-being and whereabouts. Or he was unbelievably manipulative and convincing, which makes sense when you consider his history. Anyway, to get to the point, the real meat, no pun intended, of the story, Fish brought little Grace to 359 Mountain Road, located in the East Irvington neighbourhood of Irvington, New York. And it was here the 10-year-old girl met her grisly end. Fish killed the girl and then ate her. Now, the story doesn't end here. It would be 8 years before Fish was finally brought to justice, and all off the back of a letter that he sent to Grace's parents in November 1934. So a letter arrives, Grace's mother picks it up. She can't read it, she's illiterate. So she turns to her then 26-year-old son Edward and goes, "Please read this to me, what is it?" Imagine how harrowing this would be for Edward, reading through the disgusting details that you're about to hear. Like I said, just imagine that this is exactly the first time you hear the information about your child's disappearance and how she died. Sick. Now, before I read it, please note that I've taken excerpts from the letter, as it is very long. It's the ramblings of a lunatic and could cause distress to a lot of people. You can find a link to the full transcript in the description box. "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. He then returned to New York. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100 Street, rear, right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her, on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she should go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. Okay, so I was utterly speechless when I first read that. Like I said, the ramblings of a total madman separated from reality with no empathy or understanding of the grief that he had caused this family. Encouragingly, police investigated the letter almost immediately. Whilst the story of said Captain John Davis couldn't be verified, the details around the kidnapping and subsequent events of Grace's disappearance were accurate. Now, Fish's confidence in his use of an alias when first meeting the family lent more to arrogance because he thought it would be enough to shield him from police scrutiny. However, the family's eyewitness description of Fish would help police connect him with some very interesting information regarding the letter itself. The envelope that the letter had arrived in had a small hexagonal emblem with the letters NYPCBA written on them, which stood for the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. When the police investigated this lead, a janitor for the company said that he'd left some of the stationery at his rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street when he moved out. Guess who had been lodging in that very room only a few days before the delivery of the horrific letter? Yup, Albert Fish. Now, he told the landlady that his son was about to send him some money, so asked her to hang on to it for him until he returned a few days later. So the police, naturally, waited outside Fish's lodgings for him to return. Upon his arrival, when the police interrupted and made themselves aware to him, Fish seemed quite calm and was open to going down to the station for some questioning. However, unlike Jeffrey Dahmer's cool and collected manipulation of the police officers who were investigating the Konarak synthesomphone complaint, Fish lost his cool and brandished a razor blade. Fortunately, William F. King, who was the chief investigator on this case, disarmed him quite easily and took him to the police headquarters. Now, during the investigation, and again a disclaimer here about some real disgusting detail, Fish claimed that he never meant to sexually assault Grace, but admitted that whilst kneeling on Grace's chest and strangling her, he did have 2 involuntary ejaculations. Wow, that's just, yeah, no words. Due to the scary nature of the motivation behind the murder of Grace Budd, the district attorney thought it'd be less disgusting to make this sexually motivated than cannibalism. Yeah, because that's so much better. Now, we're about to go into some details about Albert Fish's trial and what happened to him. However, I want to note that there are a few other murders uncovered during his arrest. One we discussed in part 1, that of Francis McDonnell, and the other is an equally disturbing cannibalistic one of Billy Gaffney. We don't have much time left in this video to go into those in more detail, so I'll let you investigate those on your own time. Sickening. Albert Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began on the 11th of March 1935 in West Plains, New York, and lasted all of 10 days. Longer than expected, I must admit. As mentioned in part 1, Fish pleaded insanity and kept claiming to hear voices and directions from God telling him to kill and sexually mutilate children. Several psychiatrists agreed with the claim that he was insane, and even the prosecutor called Fish a psychiatric phenomenon, and that there had never been recorded an individual with so many sexual abnormalities. The defence's chief expert witness was Frederick Wortham. Now, he was a psychiatrist with an emphasis on child development, who explained that a lot of Fish's unstable mental state derived from a fascination with the Bible and religion, specifically the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, and theorized that Fish believed similarly sacrificing another boy would be penance for his own sins. What a load of shit, I say. Why kill girls? Supposedly it was because Fish perceived Grace as a boy. So what about the little girl from part 1? Nonsense. The guy was stark raving mad and evil to the core. But hey, what do I know? Wortham also explained that Fish's cannibalism was linked to the Holy Communion, the eating of flesh. Just wow. Wow, 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 wow. Now, the prosecution, arguing against Fish's claims of insanity, despite the prosecution's previous statements about his mental state, called several doctors as witnesses, each one having some link to Fish's past and having their own rebuttals on the fact that he wasn't insane, and some even stated that his sexual fetishes were normal in society. Now, what happened next is a sign of the times. You wouldn't get this outcome nowadays due to advances in psychological assessment. Now, despite the jury agreeing that Fish was insane, they decided and agreed that he should be executed anyway for the public good. So the judge sentenced him to death by electrocution. Now, there weren't people sat around on death row for decades back then. The appeal process was limited and short. Fish arrived in Sing Sing, again, in March 1935 and was executed less than a year later, on the 16th of January 1936. He was dead within 3 minutes. Supposedly, Fish was so confused when he entered the execution chamber that he even helped the executioner put the electrodes on his body, and even commented, "I don't know why I'm here." Supposedly his death was so swift, there were rumours that due to the, if you can remember from part 1, the metal pins he used to insert into his body, they believed that that helped the current kill him quicker, which makes sense, but It was later disproved, as when you sort of measured the average time of death for him against other inmates in a similar fashion, it was very similar. Lovely bit of trivia for you there if you ever go on a game show. Now, following Albert Fisher's death, reporters met with his lawyer, James Dempsey, who revealed that he was in possession of Fisher's final statement. He refused point blank to reveal what was enclosed within, as according to Dempsey, it was the most filthy string of obscenities he had ever read. I couldn't actually find out what was in the statement, so if any of you know, please let us know below. I'd love to know. Now, before we wrap this up, please join me in remembering the victims of Albert Fisher's murderous spree. So, dear viewers, there ends the macabre tale of one Albert Fish. Thank you for being my passenger on this journey of evil. I hope you enjoyed the ride. If you did, please leave a like and a comment in the description box, and do subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future episodes. As usual, stay safe.